So I'd like to apologize for the University of British Columbia, whose economics department produced the economists who sold the quota management system to New Zealand. We do this in British Columbia. We call it the ITQ, or Individual Transferable Quota System, but it's basically the same thing. There are 4 things which the ITQ system doesn't do that economists predicted it would do that I think would be of interest to New Zealanders. One thing they predicted is that it would end overcapitalization and the race for fish, because economists thought that the big problem with the fishery is that fishermen are likely to invest too much money in boats to race to catch the fish faster if there's an open season, and there'll be this derby fishery, and they'll dissipate the rent. They'll spend all of the money they would have earned from the fishery on just the race for fish. Well, in the quota management system, it's true that the race for fish is ended. However, it's now quota that is overcapitalized, and it is overcapitalized big time. I estimated that it costs fishermen to something like 600% more to fish under the ITQ system than it did under the previous system in halibut. Plus, we had a much better system in halibut before. We had a layup system. We had a different way of dealing with the race for fish previously. There were all from Alaska, British Columbia, Washington State, a big chunk of the West Coast, much longer than the coast of New Zealand. All these fishermen's organizations got together and they figured out that if you just require a halibut, this is for Pacific halibut, if you just require a halibut fisherman to lay up or to stop fishing, stay in port for 8 to 10 days, it varied by year how long that would be, before he or she went out again, then you spread the effort out and there was no race for fish, so no problem. And that system was unfortunately ended. That was an excellent system, and it was enforced by all these fishermen's organizations. The union, for example, they wouldn't accept people's fish if they weren't obeying the layup rules. So they had lots of ways of monitoring it and enforcing it that worked really well. Didn't cost government anything. It was a great system. That ended, unfortunately, because all these new people came into the fishery when the price went up in the 80s and 70s and 80s, and they didn't join organizations, they didn't follow the rules, and the International Pacific Salmon Commission begged the U.S. and Canada to make it mandatory to follow those rules, either by joining the organizations or by just following their rules. They didn't go for it, so the layup system fell apart, and then they brought in ITQs or QMSs into the halibut fishery. So that's one thing, overcapitalization of quota. Young people cannot afford to get into the industry anymore. They can't afford either to buy quota or they can't afford to lease quota. And lease prices in most of the countries that have QMS type systems, to lease quota, you have to pay something like 70% of the value of the catch. And so you've only got 30% to make your living on, to pay all of your costs, to pay your crew. It has ruined prices. It has ruined crew payments in British Columbia. We're even talking about bringing in guest workers because you can't get skilled crew anymore. It's a disaster. So that's disaster number 2. A third problem is that quotas, market transferability. In theory, you're supposed to be a Canadian citizen with a license to own quota, but in fact, through shell companies and companies owning companies, our quotas are migrating offshore. There's a U.S. company, that's particularly true of the groundfish trawl fishery. There's a very big U.S. company that owns a whole lot of groundfish trawl licenses in the U.S. It's buying up Canadian quota. China is also buying up Canadian groundfish trawl quota. We are not controlling that. And just this year, the last cannery in BC is slated to be closed. And the fish is going to be, we believe the fish is going to be processed in China. So you're very vulnerable to losing your fish, to losing all the benefits from fishing and fish processing with something like ITQs. The whole mentality is it's more efficient if you trade it because it will automatically go to the most efficient trader. Well, in this case, it goes to where labor is cheapest. And so it's the quota owners benefit enormously, but this is theoretically owned by the country, and the country does not benefit. And I understand that some things like this have happened in New Zealand too. So it's a worldwide problem. We're terrified in Canada of what could happen.